Afternoon, and I hope everybody has a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. I know here in Minnesota, we're getting weather prognostications that indicate this could be one of the nicest Memorial Day weekends we've had in many, many years. Today, I want to talk about several questions in terms of Minnesota and its twin cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. Recently, there's been a spate of questions and comments regarding Minnesota's population. Are people leaving Minnesota? Are people leaving Minneapolis, St. Paul? And I think a lot of times people utilize the facts they want to craft the narrative they want. And I've said over and over again, I think context really cuts through a lot of the garbage. Context really, if you will, gives us a chance to see the bigger picture and to understand it. Also, I think a multitude of sources can be helpful. So I just wanted to talk briefly about what's happening in Minnesota and do it essentially from some numbers and data from different sources, trying to leave the politics aside. So first, let me start out with an article from the Star Tribune, the major Minnesota newspaper, at least in terms of circulation. Most people would identify that the Star Tribune leans left. Here's an article in the Star Tribune, January 31st, 2020. So more than 3 years ago, written by John Phelan, an opinion exchange. Here's what it says. On net, in every year from 2001 through 2016, Minnesota lost residents to other states. So just to summarize, for 16 years in a row, Minnesota lost residents. It went on to say, this article in the Strip, Minnesota gains low-income residents from other states, but loses middle and upper-income residents, generally to lower tax states. Then it went on to say, the IRS database shows that Minnesota was a net loser of residents in every income category from $50,000 up in 2017 and 18. Outmigration is very much a middle-class issue. What John Phelan is saying here is that people moving out of Minnesota is clearly an issue. It's a middle-class issue, not just an issue for the wealthy, and that Minnesota loses residents in every income category from $50,000 per person up. Let's take a look at some specifics. Let's talk about Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is an article from the American Experiment, again, written by John Phelan, March 29th, 2022, so about a year ago. The headline of this article, Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the area, Twin Cities lost 15,462 residents to other parts of America in 2021. So they're talking about the data from 2021, from the Census Bureau. More than 15,000 people left Minnesota. Okay, this is what it says. The Census Bureau paints a sorry picture when we look at the Twin Cities. In 2021, the Minneapolis-St. Paul Bloomington Metropolitan Statistical Area lost a net of 15,462 residents to other places in the United States. They went on to talk about where do we compare to other states? Or, excuse me, they compare Minneapolis-St. Paul to other metropolitan areas. And they list Phoenix as being a place that's growing, and Dallas-Fort Worth and Tampa. And then they list places that are losing population, New York and Los Angeles, San Francisco. And then you've got Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington. In this listing, we're the 12th worst. We're losing. So you wonder, is that valid data? Is that something that's a fluke? Is it something to be concerned about? So I did some research. I don't know if you can see this, but this is somewhat of a tattered newspaper, and you might be able to see the date. But the date on this is the last day of 1989. So this is the decade where Reagan was president, 8 years. The hostages in Iran were released. And George George H.W. Bush has been elected. And there's an article on the front page about our quality of life. And this is about the 1980s. So Sunday, December 31st, 1989, the newspaper says this: the legacy of the 1980s, a bigger, harsher place. And it said, people moved in. And here's what it says: thousands more people moved to the Twin Cities than moved away, helping to bring more diversity to a traditionally homogeneous area. The area gained more than 70,000 people through migration. 70,000 people. So in the 1980s, Minneapolis-St. Paul area gained 70,000 people. But in the year 2021 alone, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area lost 15,000. Well, that's interesting. I guess it asks the question, where do these people go? Well, article again by John Phelan just a couple months ago, March 9th, 2023. New Census Bureau data shows that from mid-2021 to mid-2022, 19,400 Minnesota residents left for other states. So it wasn't just Minneapolis-St. Paul taking a bath. The whole state was. And then it said, until 2001, Minnesota received more residents from other states each year than it lost to them. In 2001, things changed. From 2001 to 2016, Minnesota lost residents every year. Where do they go? Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Arizona, Idaho, Alabama, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Arkansas. We don't fare very well there. It leaves the question, who's leaving? Is it a scattergram or not? Well, this is what it says. From mid-2021 to mid-2022, 19,400 Minnesota residents left. Who left? The net migration by income was this: people who made under $10,000 came to Minnesota. 16,000 people who made between $10,000 and $25,000 came to Minnesota. People who made $25,000 to $50,000 came to Minnesota. These are people in green. These are influx to Minnesota. Now you get to the red. So this is lower income. This is higher income. So income brackets, 50 to 75, people left. 75 to 100, people left. From 100 to 200,000, an enormous amount of people left down in here. And then the last bracket was 500,000 and over. So that's who's leaving, and that's who's coming. 50,000 and under are coming. More than 50,000 are leaving. Is that an issue? Is it a problem? Well, it's probably not a problem for Florida or Arizona or Texas or Tennessee or the Carolinas. But let's turn to a source other than John Phelan, who frequently writes for the Center for the American Experiment. Let's go to Christopher Ingram. He writes for the Minnesota Reformer, a left-leaning publication. May 15th, 2023, less than 2 weeks ago. Are Minnesotans really fleeing to low-tax states, is what he says. He talks about a variety of political issues, but I'm trying to stay away from those. I just want to answer the questions. Here's what it says in his article. Back in the 1990s, Minnesota was actually gaining population from other places in the United States. There's no denying the trend is downward. Looking at 2022 data and adjusting for total population, Minnesota is in the lower middle of the pack of the United States when it comes to migration gains and losses. Now, I found that interesting. They said the lower middle of the pack. I thought, lower middle of the pack. I just didn't think that was clear. So I went and looked at his actual data. And actually, if you look at his data, Minnesota's 12th from the bottom. So maybe that's more crystal clear context. Is when it comes to people leaving, Minnesota's 12th from the last. What else does this article have to say? Well, Chris Ingram says the COVID-19 pandemic has had far-reaching demographic consequences. All right, but I just told you that pre-COVID, from 2001 to 2016, Minnesota was losing every year. So are we sort of trying to make excuses with an excuse that wasn't in existence during the 16 years that Minnesota was losing population? This article in the Minnesota Reformer, Christopher Ingram, says this: some Minnesotans are leaving, but others are moving here to take their places. These annual shifts are small relative to the total population. These annual shifts are small compared to the total population. Okay, but what about the impact? Is the impact small? I think that makes us ask the question, what is the impact? And this is what an article by John Phelan in 2021 says in October. It says, data shows our state has seen net inflows of people in every income category below $50,000 annually and outflows at every income level above that. And then it goes on to say this: in 2018, the bottom 30% of Minnesota households by income paid no individual income tax. I'm going to say that again. The bottom 30% of Minnesota households by income paid no individual income tax. And then he goes to the other side. The top 10% of Minnesota households by income paid 59.4, or 60% of the total income tax in Minnesota. So the bottom 30% paid none. The top 10% paid 60%. What would that mean? Is that impactful? Does that mean that you're going to have, if you have a clear-cut migratory pattern of people moving into Minnesota with incomes less than $50,000, potentially at the beginning of their careers or whatever, potentially looking for opportunity, but also potentially needing safety net programs that are there to help them? So you have more of them moving in, and then you have that large group of high-income households and high-income individuals who pay 60%, the top 10% pay 60% of the Minnesota income taxes. They're leaving. Does that impact on how you're going to be able to create and maintain our parks and systems, our lakes, fishing, rivers, our transportation system? Is it going to impact on our ability to help people with daycare credits, feeding the hungry, providing support for paid family leave programs? If we have the people who are paying the great majority of the income tax leaving, and the people coming aren't paying income tax, am I being politically incorrect by asking the question, is this sustainable? See, I think these are the kinds of conversations we need to be having. I don't think we need to be having hyperpolarized conversations by people who have a clear political agenda. I think we need to have honest conversations about the context. And I don't think there's a whole lot of people standing around the United States looking at Minnesota with its sub-zero temperatures in December, January, February. It's nearly 100 inches of snow the past winter, record-breaking snows, if you will, and people saying, boy, I've got to move to Minnesota in order to have a piece of that weather. I really want to live through those winter months. I don't think that's happening. So I think we have to ask the question, why do people move to Minnesota? Why do people leave Minnesota? Is it an issue? And the best way to answer it is look at the real numbers and look at the context. Thanks for listening and have a great Memorial Day weekend.